The morning Beverly Marsh decided to humiliate Darnell Okafor, she laughed about it on the phone before she even went to bed. She had called Cecilia Pratt at 9:47 in the evening and told her what she had arranged, and Cecilia had laughed too, and Beverly had used the word joke twice in that conversation. And when she hung up, she felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has found the precise instrument of someone else's destruction and used it without getting their hands dirty. The instrument was 8 boats, wrecked ones, pulled from back channels and shallow water dump sites across St. Helena Sound by a man named Dale, who owned a flat-deck pontoon and no particular ethics, and who Beverly had paid $400 to do the work after midnight so no one would see. She had selected the boats herself, driving Dale to 3 different sites in her white Lexus over the course of 2 weeks, pointing at things half submerged in brackish water and saying, "That one, and yes, that one too." She had specified the orange nylon rope. She had told Dale to make sure the last boat in the line sat low enough to look like it was going under. At 6:43 the following morning, a man named Pete, who worked the fuel dock 2 slips down, called Darnell and described what was floating against his pilings. A 1991 Mako center console with a cracked hull and no engine, a twin outboard Grady White with the transom rotted through, 3 fishing skiffs in various states of dissolution, a 22-foot wellcraft with the windshield punched out and the bilge pump missing, a Boston whaler outrage with the entire starboard gun all gone. And at the end of the line, tied last and sitting lowest, a 1987 Chris Craft Commander with a hole in the fiberglass below the waterline that Pete described as roughly the size of a dinner plate. Darnell listened without speaking. Pete said he thought Darnell should know before the harbor master came by at 8. Darnell thanked him, set the phone on the counter. Behind him, his daughter Imani sat at the kitchen table, working through a bowl of oatmeal. She said, "Is everything okay, Daddy?" He said, "Eat your breakfast." She said, "You're putting peanut butter on the outside of the bag." He looked down. He pulled a paper towel off the roll, wiped the bag clean, and started again. He already knew who had sent the boats. He already knew why. What Beverly Marsh did not know, could not have known, was what she had just handed him. He zipped the lunch bag and set it by the door. He had work to do. Before the rest of this story comes out, drop your city in the comments right now. People are watching from every corner of this country, and I want to know where you are. Subscribe if you have not and ring that bell, because what Darnell did with those 8 broken boats is one of the most methodical and quietly devastating things I have ever had to piece together. Stay with me. Darnell Okafor grew up in Charleston, 20 minutes north of Beaufort, in a house close enough to the water that he could smell low tide from his bedroom window. His father repaired outboard motors out of a converted carport for 31 years. Darnell spent most of his childhood on an overturned bucket, handing his father tools before they were asked for. By 11, he could identify a fouled carburetor by the sound of a cold start. By 14, he had rebuilt his first lower unit. By 17, he had done work that grown men in the trade had declared impossible. He studied marine systems at the Technical College of the Lowcountry, then spent 2 years on commercial fishing vessels out of Port Royal before a man named Gerald Tate, who ran a small marine restoration company on Ladies Island, offered him a job. Gerald was 62 and had forgotten more about fiberglass repair than most people would ever learn. They worked well together because neither of them wasted words. It was also, without either of them naming it, something close to what Darnell had lost when his father died of a stroke the summer he turned 26. He was 31 when he met Camille. She was a marine surveyor. She climbed around hulls and bilges, writing reports that were specific and unsparing. She was methodical and funny, and she had a habit of tapping her thumbnail against her bottom lip when she was thinking through a problem. She also had strong opinions about the correct ratio of coffee to water in a French press, and communicated those opinions freely and without invitation. They were together 4 years before Imani was born. They were engaged but not yet married when Camille was diagnosed with an aggressive lymphoma at 34. She died 11 months after the diagnosis. Imani was 3. She is 8 now. She taps her thumbnail against her bottom lip when she is working through something. She does not know she does it. Gerald Tate retired the year Darnell turned 34 and sold him the business, the tools, the inventory, the client list, and the name. He said it had taken 20 years to build what Tate Marine Restoration meant on St. Helena Sound, and there was no reason to change it. Darnell paid him in installments over 4 years. He bought the property on Marsh Creek Road the following year. A small workshop, 1,200 square feet, tools on pegboards, parts bins labeled in black marker, a hydraulic lift he rebuilt from a salvage unit in Savannah. Behind the workshop, a 3-room house with white clapboard siding that needed painting on the north side. The dock extended 60 feet over the water. He had 1 part-time employee, a 23-year-old named Kwame Asante, who had come through a vocational program at the technical college and who turned out to have a near-instinctive understanding of marine electrical systems. The work was not glamorous, the margins were thin, and the hours were long, and there were weeks when Darnell came home with his hands cracked and his back aching and reheated whatever he had cooked on Sunday because cooking again was not a thing he had left in him. Imani ate the reheated food without complaint. She had learned to read his silences. When he was merely tired, she left him alone, and when something was genuinely wrong, she climbed onto the couch next to him without asking and sat there, not watching the television, just present, on the kitchen windowsill, next to the small, succulent Camille had bought the week they moved in. There was a blue enamel mug with a chipped handle. Every morning, Darnell filled it with coffee and set it on the dock railing during his first walk-through of the day. He did not drink it out there. He brought it back inside half-cold and finished it at the sink. He had done this every morning for 5 years without explaining it to anyone. The morning after Pete's phone call, he stood at the end of the dock with the mug and looked at 8 wrecked boats tied with orange rope in a line so deliberate it could only have been planned. He stood there for a while. Then he went inside and got a spiral notebook and started writing. Beverly Marsh had lived in the Castle Point neighborhood of Beaufort for 37 years. She moved there as a young woman with her first husband, Harold, a commercial real estate developer who built strip malls across the Lowcountry with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. Harold died 9 years ago and left her with money, property, and a carefully maintained position at the center of local civic life. She chaired the Beaufort Waterfront Improvement Committee. She sat on the board of 2 neighborhood associations. She had the direct number of the county planning director. She had wanted the Marsh Creek Road property herself. She had described her plans to the planning board as community-oriented green space development, and everyone in the room understood her to mean a second dock for her own vessels. She had been outbid by $14,000. Darnell had spent 6 weeks studying comparable sales before submitting his number. She filed her first noise complaint against his operation 11 days after he opened. Over the following 2 years, she filed 6 more. She attended a zoning hearing and testified that the character of the waterfront was being degraded. She photographed his supply deliveries and sent the images to the county code office, arguing that his driveway constituted a commercial loading zone in a mixed residential area. She flagged his signage as oversized. 2 complaints resulted in inspections that found nothing actionable. The others were closed without response. Darnell appeared at none of the hearings. In March of the year Imani turned 8, Beverly came to the property for the first time herself. She parked the Lexus on the gravel shoulder and walked down the slope in shoes that were not suited for the terrain. Darnell was pressure washing the hull of a 2003 Contender. He turned off the washer when he saw her. She stopped at the property line, marked by a low post with a reflective orange cap, and said she was giving him the opportunity to negotiate a sale before she took further action. She said the property had been commercially rezoned in error, and she had documentation to support a reversal. He waited until she finished. He said, "I appreciate you telling me." She said the next conversation would not be a courtesy. She left. He turned the washer back on. 3 weeks later, the boats appeared. Beverly had hand-selected them for condition and humiliation value. She had paid Dale $400, and she had told him specifically to place the Chris Craft last in the line so its waterlogged stern would face the workshop door. She wanted Darnell to see it first thing. She wanted him standing at the property line, overwhelmed and undone, on the phone to the harbor master, trying to explain why 8 derelict vessels were now his legal problem. She told Cecilia it was a joke. She told the Wachowskis it was a joke. She went to sleep satisfied. What she did not know was what the boats actually were. Darnell had been in correspondence with a buyer since the previous October. His name was Richard Calloway. He was 68, retired, and in possession of a commercial property in Mount Pleasant, where he had been planning for 4 years to open a working museum of vintage American powerboats. The concept was specific and well-funded, a combination of display, education, and active restoration, with boats in various stages of work visible to visitors through a glass partition. Calloway had backing from 2 private collectors and a grant application pending with the South Carolina Arts Commission. He had been looking for a restoration partner, someone with the technical skill for structural and mechanical repair and the discipline for period-accurate cosmetic work, the kind that could return a vintage vessel to a condition indistinguishable from its factory state. Gerald Tate had given Calloway Darnell's name. They met in November at a diner in Beaufort over coffee that neither of them touched, and talked for 3.5 hours. Darnell had brought a binder of photographs, finished work, before and after, with handwritten notes on materials and process. Calloway looked through it without speaking. At the end, he asked 2 technical questions. Darnell answered both in enough detail that Calloway said, "I have met with 6 other shops, and none of them gave me an answer like that." The arrangement they were working toward was a restoration and acquisition contract contract covering the museum's founding collection of 12 vessels, with an option to extend. Callaway would source the vessels, and Darnell would restore them. Upon completion of each restoration, title would transfer to Callaway's Museum Trust at an agreed acquisition price per vessel, with restoration costs billed separately. The acquisition values alone, across 12 period vessels, totaled just over $2.4 million. With restoration fees on top of that, the total contract was structured to reach and likely exceed $3 million across its full term. Darnell had not told anyone, not Gerald, not Kwame, not the credit union officer who had recently called about his refinancing terms. The contract was not signed. Callaway was careful and methodical. Darnell understood this. He was the same way. He did not intend to live inside a half-true story. The contract was supposed to be finalized in the third week of April. Beverly had moved the boats on the 3rd of April. Kwame arrived at 7:30 and stood at the end of the dock before walking back to where Darnell was writing in the spiral notebook at his workbench. Kwame said, "Those are some bad boats." Darnell said, "Some of them." Kwame said, "What are we doing with them?" Darnell set the pen down. He had been writing for 40 minutes. What he had written was an intake assessment, a line for each vessel, structural condition, estimated repair cost, estimated acquisition value. It was preliminary. Some of it would turn out to be wrong in the best possible direction. He said, "I need you to get in the water and measure the hole in the Chris Craft's hull." Kwame looked at him. He said, "Okay." He went to get the waders. What Darnell understood, standing at that workbench, was something he had understood since the age of 11. Most people looked at a wrecked boat and saw what it cost. He looked at a wrecked boat and saw what it was worth. Those were not the same number, and the distance between them was where his entire professional life lived. 6 of the 8 boats were structurally salvageable. The Mako was a cosmetic case. The cracked hull was surface damage only, a stress fracture along the port bow that had spread from a hard grounding at some point in the vessel's past, but had not compromised the underlying laminate. The Wellcraft was similar, significant labor in the topside and interior, but nothing below the waterline that could not be addressed with the right materials and enough time. The 3 skiffs were straightforward rebuilds, the kind of methodical work that required patience more than expertise, and Kwame could run all 3 with minimal oversight once Darnell had done the initial assessments and written the work orders. The Grady White's transom was rotted through in 2 places, but the rot had not traveled into the stringer system, which meant it was a 2-week job with the right epoxy and the right glass cloth, and a willingness to work in close quarters with a respirator for several days running. The Boston whaler outrage was the one that surprised him. The missing gunwale looked catastrophic from the dock. Up close, once Kwame had pulled the vessel out of the water, and they had both spent an hour going over it with flashlights and a moisture meter, the hull beneath was fundamentally sound. Boston Whaler had been building unsinkable hulls since the 1960s, using a foam-filled fiberglass sandwich construction that was nearly impossible to destroy without trying very hard. Whoever had removed the gunwale had done cosmetic damage only. The boat itself was intact. The Chris Craft was something else entirely. He had known it from the dock. The way a vessel sits in the water tells you things about its structure that a close inspection only confirms. The Chris Craft sat with a particular heaviness along the starboard quarter that indicated the damage was localized and the rest of the hull was holding. He had Kwame pull it out on Friday morning, and he went over every inch of it himself, starting at the transom and working forward on both sides, tapping the fiberglass with his knuckles in the way his father had taught him, listening for the dull, hollow sound that meant delamination. He found it in 2 small areas near the bow, manageable. The hole below the waterline was exactly what Pete had described, the size of a dinner plate, punched through from outside, the edges clean enough to suggest impact rather than rot. The interior was wet but not destroyed. The engine was gone, but the engine beds were solid. The brightwork along the cabin sides was weathered and checked, but the wood beneath it was not soft. He stood back and looked at the boat for a long time. Then he called Richard Callaway. He described it methodically: year, model, hull configuration, the nature and precise location of the damage, the condition of the stringers, the engine beds, the cabin structure, the brightwork. He described what was missing and what remained. Callaway listened without interrupting. When Darnell finished, there was a pause. Callaway said, "That is on my list." Darnell said, "I thought it might be." Callaway said, "Is it yours to sell?" Darnell said he would know by the end of week. He spent the next 3 days doing what he had always done: careful, specific, documented work. He pulled registration history on each vessel through the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources database, working through the results methodically and writing his findings in the spiral notebook in the same black pen he used for everything. 3 of the boats were registered to owners whose registrations had lapsed without renewal, which under South Carolina law created a pathway to abandoned vessel status after a documented waiting period that had, in 2 of the 3 cases, already elapsed. Two had been formally classified as derelict by Beaufort County and released for disposal the previous year, their paperwork sitting in the county records office under a filing category that most people never thought to look at. One had been voluntarily surrendered by its owner following a bankruptcy proceeding, the surrender documented in federal court filings that were public record and which Darnell had found in 40 minutes of online research on a Tuesday night after Imani went to sleep. The Wellcrafts chain of title was the complicated one. 4 owners across 11 years, one of them a dissolved LLC, one of them an estate that had never been properly probated. He called a maritime attorney named Susan Farrell, whom he had worked with twice before on salvage questions. She called him back the following morning and told him it was solvable and gave him a timeline. By the end of the week, he had clean title, or the legally documented pathway to it, on 7 of the 8 vessels. The 8th had a lien from a marine supply company in Savannah that would take 3 additional weeks to resolve through the proper discharge process. He filed the paperwork on each one and noted the status in the notebook with the date and the next required action. He told Kwame on a Thursday evening when the shop was quiet and the light outside had gone the particular amber color it went in late April over the water. Kwame stood very still for a moment. He said, "Are you telling me she accidentally donated you a museum collection?" Darnell picked up the notebook and walked toward the door. He said, "Get here early tomorrow. Calloway is coming Friday." Richard Calloway arrived in a dark green pickup truck and parked without ceremony. He was a quiet man who wore reading glasses on a cord and carried a flashlight even in daylight, a habit Darnell recognized immediately as someone who had spent decades looking into dark places in boats. They shook hands at the dock. Darnell walked him down the line. Beverly arrived 12 minutes later. She had driven past the property the previous afternoon and seen Kwame and Darnell moving the Chris craft on the boat Dolly with a care that confused her. She had not understood what she was seeing. She had come back to understand it. She parked on the shoulder and came down the slope without the blazer this time, and she stopped at the orange post on the property line. She called out across the dock. She said, "I see you got my delivery." Darnell was standing at the Chris craft's bow with Calloway. He did not turn around. She said it again, louder, with something in her voice that wanted to be amusement and was not quite getting there. Calloway looked at Darnell. Darnell said quietly, "Those are the vessels I mentioned." Calloway nodded. Beverly took a step over the property line. She had her phone out. She said she was calling the harbor master to report that he was in unlawful possession of boats she owned. Calloway turned and looked at her with the mild, assessing expression of a man who had spent 40 years in business and knew immediately when something was not going to go the way the other party expected. He said, "Ma'am, I have been reviewing the intake documentation on these vessels since yesterday evening, and I sent the title analysis to my attorney last night as a matter of due diligence. He says the pathway to clear title on 6 of them is solid. The 7th will clear within the month." Beverly said, "That is not possible." Calloway said, "I would not have driven down here this morning if it were not." She looked at Darnell. He was looking at the waterline where Kwame had begun the first round of hull assessment on the Chris craft. He had a pencil behind his ear and resin dust on his forearm from something he had been doing before Calloway arrived. He said, "I appreciate you bringing them down." That was all. She looked at the boat. She looked at Calloway. She looked at her phone. She turned and walked back up the slope. She did not call the harbor master. There was nothing to report. She had selected abandoned vessels from public waterways and had them deposited on private property belonging to a licensed marine restoration business, and she had not researched what the law made of that sequence of events before she set it in motion. He had. The harbor master stopped by at noon, as he did most Fridays. Darnell showed him the intake paperwork. The harbor master said he would need storage permits for the outer dock while the work was staged. Darnell went inside and came back with the forms already filled out. The harbor master looked at them. He said, "Beverly giving you trouble again?" Darnell said, "Not really." The harbor master accepted the forms and left. Calloway stayed for another 2 hours. Before he left, he stood at the bow of the Chris craft for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "I want this one first." Darnell said, "I know." She sat in the Lexus on the shoulder of Marsh Creek Road for a long time before she started the engine. She could see the dock from where she sat. She could see the line of boats she had spent 2 weeks selecting and $400 moving. She could see Darnell at the bow of the Chris craft, doing what he did every day, which was work. She thought about the zoning hearing. She thought about the phrase she had practiced in her bathroom mirror, degrading the character of the waterfront. She had stood at that podium and felt entirely within her rights. She thought about the planning board official's face when Darnell's paperwork had turned out to be in perfect order. She had read that face at the time as bureaucratic inconvenience. She was reading it differently now. She thought about the calls she had made this morning before driving over. She had told Cecilia. She had told the Wachowskis. She had used the word joke both times. She had expected to be calling them back within the hour with the image of Darnell standing at the property line, overwhelmed and undone. The man with the reading glasses had said the title work was solid. She thought about the child she had seen once, getting out of the truck at the end of the driveway, backpack on one shoulder, hair still wild from sleep, running toward the workshop door. She had not thought about the child in any of her planning. She was thinking about her now, and she didn't know what to do with that. She started the engine. She did not call Cecilia back. She drove home and watered her plants, and stood in her kitchen for a while doing nothing in particular, and then watered them again. The signed contract arrived by email on a Thursday morning in the third week of May. It covered 14 vessels in total, the 11 from Callaway's original founding collection, plus 3 from Beverly's boats that met his period and condition criteria, including the Chris-Craft Commander as the anchor piece. The structure was acquisition plus restoration. Callaway's Museum Trust would purchase each vessel outright upon completion of restoration, with restoration fees billed against a separate retainer. The acquisition values had been individually negotiated based on Callaway's collection assessments and Darnell's documented appraisals. The total contract value, across acquisition payments and restoration fees, was $3,140,000. Darnell printed the email. He folded it and put it in the workbench drawer under a layer of pencils and a spare impeller for a Yamaha 150. He picked up his phone and called Kwame. Kwame said, "How much?" Darnell told him. Kwame was quiet for 3 full seconds. He said, "Mr. Okafor." Darnell said, "I need you to come on Saturday. I want to start the whaler transom work this weekend." Kwame said, "You're going to tell me to come on Saturday?" Darnell said, "I just did." Kwame said, $3 million, and you're telling me to come on Saturday? Darnell said, "The boat doesn't care about the number." He heard Kwame exhale. Then Kwame said, "I'll be there at 7. He hung up. Darnell stood at the workbench for a moment. He opened the drawer. He looked at the folded email without picking it up. Then he closed the drawer and went back to work. That evening, he picked Imani up from school. She got in the truck with a drawing folded into eighths in her coat pocket. She unfolded it and held it up. It was a boat, mostly blue, with a brown dock underneath it, and a figure standing at the end of the dock. He asked what the figure was holding. She said, "A coffee mug." He looked at it for a moment. The light at the intersection was red. She said, "Is that okay?" He said, "That's exactly right." The light changed. She said, "Daddy, what does abandoned mean?" He said, "Where did you hear that word?" She said, "You and Mr. Kwame were talking, and he said a lady gave you abandoned boats." Darnell drove for a block and a half. He said, "It means something someone left behind because they decided it wasn't worth anything anymore." Imani looked out her window. She said, "But it was worth something." He said, "A lot of things are worth something that people don't see." She thought about this. Then she refolded the drawing and put it back in her pocket. She took it out again a moment later and looked at it with the particular scrutiny of someone checking their own work against an internal standard nobody else had access to. At the next light, he glanced over. Her thumbnail was against her bottom lip. He looked back at the road and did not say anything. Beverly came on a Saturday morning in early June when the neighborhood was quiet and the air still carried the cool of a Carolina spring before the heat arrived to stay. She parked on the road and walked down the slope without the blazer. She was wearing a green cotton shirt and carrying a covered dish with a rubber-sealed lid. Darnell was on the dock replacing a cleat on the Grady-White starboard rail. He heard footsteps on the gravel and looked up. She stopped at the orange post. She was not a person who asked for things easily. He could see that in the way she was standing, her left hand holding the edge of the lid, even though the lid was already sealed. She said, "I made too much of a chicken and rice casserole." She held it out across the property line. He set the cleat wrench on the dock rail and walked over and took the dish. He said, "Thank you." She said, $3.50 for about 20 minutes. He said, "I know how to heat a casserole." She looked at the dock. She was not done with something, and she was working up to it in the way that people work up to things they have no practice saying. She said, "What I did with the boats was wrong?" He did not fill the silence after she said it. He said, "Yes," one word. No expansion, no absolution, no invitation toward anything easier. Just the one word, which held everything she deserved to sit with and offered none of the relief she may have been hoping for. Imani appeared in the workshop doorway. She had a streak of blue paint on her forearm from the model on her desk, and she was eating a cracker, looking at Beverly with the direct and unsettling attention of a child who has not yet learned the politeness of looking away. Beverly looked at her and said, "Hi there," Imani said. "Is that food?" Beverly said, "If your dad says so." Imani looked at Darnell. He said, "Go finish your model." She looked at the dish once more and went back inside, her footsteps crossing the workshop floor and fading. Beverly watched the door after she was gone. She said, "She looks like she's got something serious going on in there." Darnell said, "She does." Beverly nodded, the small nod of someone closing something carefully, not shutting it, and she turned and walked back up the slope. He carried the dish inside and set it on the counter. It was a well-used dish, the kind that had been in a kitchen a long time, taken out for things that warranted it. He stood looking at it for a moment. Then he put it in the refrigerator and went back to the cleat. The extension to the North Bay broke ground in July. Darnell had drawn the plans himself at the kitchen table after Imani went to sleep, a mechanical pencil moving across drafting paper in the quiet of a house where the only sounds were the refrigerator and the distant pull of the tide against the dock. He had drawn them 3 times before he was satisfied. The first version gave him 30 feet of additional bay. The second gave him 32 and better sight lines from the main door. The third was the one he submitted to the contractor, a man named Curtis Webb, who had built half the working docks in Beaufort County and who looked at the drawings for about 45 seconds before saying he could start the following Monday. Kwame came on full-time in August. He negotiated his own hours and his own rate, sitting across from Darnell at the workbench with a single sheet of paper he had written his terms on in advance. Darnell read it once and said yes. Kwame had earned that number, and then some, and they both understood there was nothing to discuss. The Chris Craft took 4 months. Darnell kept a separate notebook for it. Materials, hours, every decision documented in the same black pen, the specific mixing ratios for the period-correct gel coat, the hardware sources he tracked down through a dealer in Annapolis who specialized in vintage Chris Craft fittings, and who required 3 separate calls before he was convinced Darnell knew what he was asking for. The upholstery went to a woman named Patricia Gaines in downtown Beaufort, who specialized in mid-century marine interiors. She studied Darnell's reference photographs for 20 minutes without speaking, and then wrote him a list of exactly what she would need and when she would need it. When the boat was finished and sitting on its cradle under the lights of the extended bay, it looked like what it had always been beneath the damage, a 1987 Chris Craft Commander that had simply been made right. Calloway drove down the following morning. He stood in front of the boat for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "This is the one." Darnell said, "I know." The first acquisition payment cleared the following week. It came into the business account on a Tuesday morning, and Darnell saw the notification on his phone while he was packing Imani's lunch. He set the phone face down on the counter and finished making the sandwich. She came into the kitchen with her backpack and looked at him. She said, "You have your thinking face." He said, "Eat something before we go." She grabbed a banana and sat down. He said, "I have some good news about the shop." She peeled the banana and said, "Did you sell a boat?" He said, "Something like that." She said, "How much?" He said, "Enough." She looked at him for a moment with Camille's eyes, in the measuring way Camille had looked at things she was not yet sure she believed. Then she said, "Okay," and took a bite of the banana. He picked up his phone. He put it in his pocket. He picked up his keys. On a Tuesday morning in October, before Kwame arrived and before the light had fully come up over the water, Darnell walked the dock. The extended bay was behind him, its new roofline pale and clean against the older clapboard, the lumber still bright where it met the weathered original siding. Through the bay doors he could see the 4 vessels currently in various stages of restoration, sitting on their cradles in the half-dark, the Grady White with its new transom cured and ready for topside work, a 1964 Lyman runabout that Calloway had delivered 2 weeks prior, and that was going to require more time than either of them had initially estimated, and 2 others at earlier stages, their hulls chalked with Darnell's assessment notes in orange marker. The dock was solid under him, all 60 feet of it, the new cleats tight, the planking dry, and even in the cool morning air. He set the blue mug on the railing in its place. He stood there for a while. The water was flat and dark, and the early light moved across it in a way that had no analogy in any other place he had ever been. A brown pelican sat on the outermost piling with the self-possessed stillness of a creature that had been doing exactly this since before the dock existed and intended to keep doing it long after. Somewhere across the sound, a boat engine turned over, idled, settled into a steady note, and moved away. He thought about the spiral notebook in the workbench drawer. He thought about the folded email underneath the pencils and the Yamaha impeller. He thought about Curtis Webb's crew raising the bay extension walls on a July morning, while Imani watched from the workshop doorway, eating a piece of toast, asking questions that Webb's crew answered with more patience than he would have predicted. He did not think about Beverly Marsh. There was nothing left there that required his attention. He picked up the mug and carried it back inside. Imani was at the table with a bowl of cereal, her school binder open in front of her, though she was not reading anything in it. Her drawing of the dock was taped to the inside cover, the blue boat and the brown dock, and the small figure at the end holding the mug. She had decided it was finished, and she was keeping it. He had learned that when Imani taped something into her binder, it meant the thing had been evaluated and found to be true. He made her lunch, sandwich, apple slices, and the small bag of pretzels she had recently decided were the only acceptable pretzels. He put everything where it was supposed to go and zipped the bag and set it by the door. She closed the binder and picked up her backpack. At the threshold, she turned back and looked at the kitchen in the way children sometimes look at rooms they belong to, not at anything specific, just confirming it was all still there. She said, "Are there more boats coming?" He said, "There are always more boats." She nodded slowly, the nod of someone receiving information that confirms something they already suspected, and she went out the door. He listened to her feet on the gravel path. He listened until the sound was gone. He picked up his keys. He had work to do.